Chapter 28 Meditation in the Zen Temple. If you wish to seek Buddha, you must search your own nature, for this nature is Buddha himself. It is like water and ice. There is no ice apart from water. There is no Buddha apart from yourself. If you have not seen into your own nature, what is the use of thinking of Buddha, reciting the sutras, observing a fast, or keeping the precepts, not knowing that Buddha is near you? Foolish to seek him afar, like the cry of thirst in the midst of water, like wandering in a slum, being born in abundance. 100 causes of your trouble come only through your mistake, trying to bow to external objects, wandering, lingering, complaining. There is no end of sorrow in your journey in darkness. If you let light into your mind, Pure Land is not far from you. The mind is Buddha, Buddha is the way, and the way is Zen. If you see the truth is here, your voice is the chanting of the sutras. This place is the land of lotus. You yourself are Buddha. Am I Buddha? Yes, you yourself are Buddha. The sutras in Sanskrit chanted in unison sounded like music to my ears, but the one translated above is sung in the native tongue, and so remained longer in my mind, setting themes for meditation. My mental helplessness brought me at last to one of the Zen temples, for I could not surrender to Amida, who asked me to resign myself completely to the Great One's strength. The religion or philosophy which arrested my attention was one which challenged my own strength. The Zen sect of Buddhism was introduced to Japan from China late in the 12th century, and a division in this sect was brought about early in the 13th century. Zen stresses the development of the individual spiritual life, and this has appealed especially to the samurai class. In the aristocratic days before the Meiji Restoration, Zen was chiefly the church of the samurai, the intelligentsia of those days, and its adherents today are largely the descendants of the old samurai families. We now have over 20,000 Zen temples in Japan, with 35,000 Zen monks, and more than 8 million lay adherents. The Zen sect is one of the most influential in Japanese Buddhism. It stands second only to the Pure Land, or Amida sect. However, the figures for adherents cannot be taken as an accurate measurement of the influence of any religion in Japan. At the present time, they are not obtained in any precise way. A count is made of the persons whose families were listed in the different Buddhist sects under the command of the Tokugawa government. As I have explained before, I was born a member of a Zen sect family, and married into the Pure Land sect. Nominally, I was first a member of one sect, and then of another, but until these later years, when I began to take religion seriously as my own spiritual concern, I had given no consideration to the streams of thought in Buddhism, to the teaching of self-strength, or the teaching of reliance on another's strength as the means of salvation. Of what sect, then, was I actually an adherent? Now, however, I became deeply interested. The profound teachings of Zenism are said to be very simple in form, but simple is not always the synonym for easy. Zennism is the philosophy of thisness, signifying self-examination. Shakyamuni, according to Zen teachers, never preached a word about thatness during his exhortatory career of 45 years. Dharma, Bodhidharma, the powerful Hindu teacher of Zen, who went into China, floating, so the legend says, down the Yangtze River on a reed, one of the favorite subjects in Buddhist painting, appeared before the Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty in 520 AD. The emperor was a munificent patron of Buddhism, and the conversation between the great teacher of Zen Buddhism and the Chinese emperor is one of the popular subjects in the Zen philosophy textbooks. The emperor asked, "You will be interested to hear that I have built many monasteries, distributed scriptures, given alms, and upheld the faith. Have I not indeed acquired merit? None at all." Dharma answered contrary to the emperor's expectation. "In what then does true merit consist?" asked the emperor. Dharma answered that in the obliteration of matter through absolute knowledge, not by external acts, lay true merit. Dharma is said to have sat in silent meditation for 9 years, with his face turned to the wall, wrapped in red cloth, in his mountain monastery, and the Japanese children sang, "Dear Dharma-san has no legs, tightly closed lips, and large shining eyes." What Dharma declared on his first opening of the tightly closed lips after 9 years of Zazen was this: "Above and below the heaven, the truth is here in oneself." Zazen is a method of obtaining spiritual power by controlling physiological movement. That is, it is organic feeling, a balanced relation between mind and body. To reach to the psychological goal, a certain form of meditation is necessary. Half sleeping, half awake, like one insensate and yet trying hard to think in the Tokaji temple. I began practicing Zazen in the meditation hall. The chilly wind in late January seemed to kill every germ in the air, under the ground, and in the water, and to purify the human soul likewise. Dead silence was maintained by everyone within the temple room. About 30 men and a few women were my companions. I was able to sit in the same posture more than half an hour, without moving or uttering a sound, though this was a short duration of time compared with the famous meditation of Dharma. I drew my breath through my nose, deep enough to hold down my abdomen, and sent it forth slowly and quietly, repeating the process in a rhythmic tempo. Faithfully I tried to hold my breath while I counted from 1 to 10, and after 10, breathing, then began from 1 again, repeating the process over and over, endeavoring to concentrate my mind on this thing. My lips were tightly closed, like divine dharmas, my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth. Like the people around me, I sat on a rough hard cushion in a squatting position. All the time I kept my body erect, so that the tip of my nose and my navel should be in one perpendicular line, and my ears and shoulders on horizontal lines. I crossed my legs in front, putting my feet on opposite thighs. My hands rested lightly in my lap. As I kept my eyes half open during the whole period of meditation, I could see only 4 or 5 feet ahead of me. On the dark mat floor of the hall, the flickering candle light cast faint shadows. There were only 4 or 5 candle stands in this spacious meditation place, which scarcely gave enough light for the 2 young barefooted monks to move about stealthily on the icy cold mats. Each of them held a bamboo rod, 5 feet long, with which he tapped those who had fallen asleep when they were supposed to be practicing the art of putting their mind in a vacant condition, sinking themselves willingly into the universe, giving up every attempt at self-guidance, letting the subconscious forces control. Though this emptiness of the mind which is sought in Zazen is far removed from unconsciousness or sleep, many of the practitioners do lose consciousness. To practice the emptying of one's mind must seem queer enough to the Westerner. It is queer to the Japanese of other sects as well. But Zen teachers go further. They believe that the mere sitting and practicing of meditation does not produce the spiritual capacity to create the unity of thinking that any human being possesses as a personality. So, in order to attain this purpose, the pupils are given koan, or problems, designed for unified thought. It is said that there are something like 1,700 koan in Zennism, and every one of them is a surprise to the uninitiated. They puzzle the pupils of Zen to the highest possible degree. They induce the direct opposite of logical argument or a scientific solution. Those pupils who are interested and enthusiastic enough are assigned Zen problems for solutions. One usually struggles with a single problem week after week for months, and even years, whether awake or asleep. If the answer which he brings to the abbot is wrong, and he fails to pass the examination, he has to keep on thinking about the same problem until he finally works it out. Often the teacher beats the pupil who is too stupid to answer correctly. The external words spoken are not very important. The teacher judges his pupil's victory by his face, manner, or perhaps by his footsteps as he approaches through the long corridor for the meditation hall to the examination room. I was afraid that I could not find a proper solution to any of these queer problems, and that I might be beaten every time I appeared in the presence of the abbot. I did not have courage enough to advance to that step of Zen, but I learned what the koan are, and what solutions and explanations are set forth in the books of Zen philosophy. This was very interesting and helpful in my study of this cult. It would be fruitless to attempt to explain here the contents of koan problems and their answers, because their meaning depends so much on the original Chinese words and characters, as well as on the habits and manners of Zen living, and it is impossible to translate them into any other language. However, many college students and other intellectual Japanese are struggling with them, simultaneously with their efforts to pass college examinations or carry on the business of daily life. The outstanding character of the Zen sect is the stress placed on experience and on life itself. Cult, theory, and learning are secondary. The cone problems are based chiefly on the endless series of anecdotes recording the minutest happenings in the lives of famous Zen monks and their trivial sayings. But from the Zen point of view, behind these trifling acts and sayings lies a deep significance. The pupil, in struggling with these problems, is supposed to obtain the mental power which was once possessed by the ancient Zen masters. Fire is cool if one denies the mind's consciousness. Thus declared Izan, the distinguished Zen divine. In the 16th century, he was burnt in his temple by General Nobunaga, who destroyed hundreds of religious edifices to eliminate the political influence of Buddhism at that time. One is able to gain the Zen mental strength by constant drill, just as one obtains physical strength by continuous discipline of one's body. The cone is often a question full of apparent inconsistencies, or it is planned to lead one's thinking into the trap of inconsistency. If one's knowledge is limited to plain common sense learning, one repeatedly faces sudden irrationalities in practical affairs without preparation from orthodox religious teachers. It is a pity, the Zen teachers say, for one to be caught in this immense illogical maze, unable to cut his way through with his limited knowledge. So Zen furnishes the mental exercise, as a result of which one may free oneself from confusion and despair. Reading such an abstract explanation of this queer zazen may even put my readers to sleep, but I know what it means to try to ward off the sleepy devils, while I am struggling to find the Buddha myself. In spite of my hard drill in zazen during the severe winter nights, I did not accomplish very much. On the contrary, I detected a peculiar brusquerie and cynicism in the most of the Zen practitioners, which may be the result of denying the reality of the world too much and dwelling to excess on abstractions, for one cannot live wholly out of society. I found myself not quite contented with Zen, and I left the temple in the late spring when the peony blossoms were in full flower everywhere in the temple court and around the gray gravestones. Nevertheless, I retain a warm, lingering affection for this sect, whose quiet atmosphere is very dear to me. Chapter 29. Nichiren, the Sun Lotus. Though I did not go much further in Zen philosophy, I gained a certain mental strength with which to overcome my restlessness and the ill state of my nerves, caused by leading an active life like many people of the present age, a life of rush and struggle in the midst of various anxieties. A certain serenity of mind I have since acquired, and I must attribute a great deal of it to the teachings and meditations in the Zen temple. I grew to believe, however, that Zennism is a sort of cowardly attitude to life, whose solid realities it purposely overlooks. The spirit of Zennism has not, of course, always been a negative and cynical thing in relation to actual life. There have been divines who were men of action as well as spiritual force, but Zennism has often been abused, and it has been bent, to a great extent, in a wrong direction. I observe most of the people who are absorbed in this religion toying with mere metaphysical arguments, cynically and lazily pretending to be indifferent to contemporary social problems. I could not find one bit of happiness for myself if the ultimate happiness of mankind were out of the picture, and this excluded me from strict Zennism. On my religious pilgrimages, I reached the goal of spiritual enlightenment, not in Mecca nor in India, under the Bo tree in Buddha's nirvana, but on the dusty bookshelves of my husband's library. There I found many works on the sect which was founded in the 13th century by Nichiren, whose name is a synonym for brave action related to ideals. I am Joku Bosatsu. I am here to preach the gospel of the Lotus Sutra. Shyaka himself prophesied my coming. I am here and shall be the great eyes to the land of the rising sun. So the prophet Nichiren spoke. The literal translation of his name is Sun Lotus. He was born the son of a fisherman in a village not far from Tokyo. His mother dreamed of this child as the product of a sun's ray shooting into her body, the kind of legend behind the birth of every great religious leader. Being an unusually clever boy, he was sent to a temple near his village, in those days the only place for one to obtain knowledge. While he studied in this local temple, his clever questions and profound eagerness for the further study of Buddhism led the elder priest to send this young monk to the Rendai Monastery on Mount Hai near Kyoto, which contained at that time a wonderful university for Buddhist students as well as the great cathedral of the Tendai sect. After many years' study and meditation, he came to his enlightened conviction through the Gospel of the Lotus Sutra, and all through his life he fought for this gospel, bringing on a revolution in Japanese Buddhism. In his later years, he set a firm foundation for the Nichiren sect, which still remains quite an active one among the Buddhists, though it is a pretty noisy religion on account of its mass processions with the vigorous beating of drums and the chanting of Nam Holy Lotus Sutra. Nichiren's fiery devotion to his faith and his effort to live in accordance with his ideals were rare in the history of Japanese Buddhism. While Japanese history is replete with feudal heroes, there have been few comparable religious heroes. If Zen is the religion of solitude, an argument for nihilism, Nichiren is the religion of social righteousness, requiring action under persecution and every difficulty. It is aggressive against social injustice. It is the only sect of Japanese Buddhism which declares the unfairness of ranking women below men. Nichiren's affection for his mother made him resent the point of view so generally held by Buddhists that womankind is sinful and unworthy of salvation. In opposition, he declared, "Man is pillar and woman is frame. Man is wing and woman is body. If the wing is separated from the body, how can it fly?" However, my interest in Nichiren is not in its doctrines as a cult, but in Nichiren himself, as in the case of many other great religious leaders. There are many miraculous stories told of him. These do not affect me. Their origin often may be traced to the zealous imagination of his followers, who make their master a superhuman being and thus spoil his real value as a person. My interest in Nichiren has to do with his spiritual strength and the courage which never failed him, even when faced with the threat of death. After many years of study and pilgrimages to the great divines of his age, Nichiren finally stood forth as an independent prophet. He appeared alone on the streets of Kamakura, the capital during the Hojo feudal regime. Nichiren openly denied Jodo Zenitsu and Shingon, the sects which did not preach the Lotus Sutra. He was alone. The rulers and the whole nation were against him. When he cried out, "Heaven and the four seas will come under this holy Lotus Sutra," the people shouted, "Hey, this crazy monk!" They threw stones at him and burned his hut to drive him away. For shame, the leaders of other sects declared, "Don't leave this insane monk free to preach on the streets and insult the whole of Buddhism." They were enraged and appealed to the shogunate to suppress the insolent fellow. He was exiled and deserted on a small rocky island in the sea. Nearby, however, was a fisherman's hamlet, and soon he was taken there by its humble and warm-hearted folk. His banishment gave Nichiren a chance to preach his gospel among these simple people, and he made new converts. After that, whenever he was compelled to wander, he added to the number of his followers, and was the more confirmed in his own conviction by their response to his preaching. After he was recalled to Kamakura for his exile, he wrote his famous discourse on social righteousness and national defense, and dedicated it to the shogunate. He denounced the shogunate's policy and prophesied the foreign invasion which occurred a few years later when Kublai Khan, the great chief of the Mongols and the emperor of all China, sent his fleet to conquer the little island empire at the end of the 13th century. At that time, Japan was in a state of economic and social confusion, distraught by frequent earthquakes and famines. And to the shogunate, this accurate forecast by Nichiren was but an added insult, making Nichiren a super nuisance. Accepting his enemy's accusation of him, the government imprisoned this Lotus Sutra prophet and finally sentenced him to death on the charge of treason. His reply was, "Nichiren, being born on this land, shall obey its law physically, but shall never succumb to this command spiritually." He then turned to his followers and commanded them as follows: "Do not any of you be coward enough to deny that he is a disciple of Nichiren. Do not be drawn back from your faith for the sake of your estate or family. In the infinite space of time in the past, the number of those who dedicated their lives for the sake of the feudal lord or of the family has been innumerable like the sands on the shore, but a single life has not yet been dedicated to the honor of Lotus Sutra. Do not hesitate to be the honorable soldier for this holy gospel. To dedicate our humble lives for the sake of Lotus Sutra is like exchanging a stone for a mass of gold, dung for rice. If you fear the threat of the mere master of this small island state, how can you prepare yourself to stand in the presence of great Ima, the mighty Lord of Hell? Having sworn to serve Buddha, timid servants are worthless. What is the significance of life and death to you? There is only life and death in the truth of the Holy Sutra of Lotus. What spiritual force, what conviction! Sneering at earthly power, which ordered him to die, he described his persecutor as a mere master of little islands. Nichiren faced death as calmly as if he were facing home. With a volume of the Lotus Sutra in his hand, he was led to the place of execution on the sandy Kamakura shore. The brave preacher chanted the sutra loudly as he sat on the seat of death. He was 50 years old at the time. The autumn moon was casting her pale light on the silently grieving disciples who had assembled for the last earthly look at their great teacher. But Nichiren's chanting voice alone echoed in the whole place, against the silver tide flowing and ebbing. The warriors, whose duty it was to cut off this holy prophet's head, were almost paralyzed by the sight of their undaunted victim, whose spiritual force so inspired them that it was scarcely possible for them to raise their swords against him. After having struggled in vain to do so, they finally knelt down before Nichiren and confessed how deeply they were impressed. Just then a horseman arrived to deliver a message from the authorities, announcing the release of Nichiren from the penalty of death. He was again exiled, however, to a remote island in the rough sea of Japan, far north of Japan proper. It was like deportation to the icy wilderness of Siberia. The snowy winter had already come to this northern island of Sado when Nichiren arrived. The shogunate authorities, who were afraid of killing this prophet with their own hands, planned to let him die alone in the cold of the northern snow and the bitterness of hunger. A wretched hut 6 feet square in the Tuscahara Valley was his only permitted shelter. In this tiny hut he lifted a small image of Buddha from the bosom of his torn robe and began his holy chanting, Nam-myoho Horin Gekko, Nam Holy Lotus Sutra. The snowflakes fell on the earthen floor and heaped in Nichiren's lap, covering the image of Buddha. He passed nights protected merely by a straw hat and a grass raincoat. When the snow got deeper and heavier, Nichiren's meals, which were supposed to be brought from the neighboring village, were cut off. Many days in the snowbound valley he did not eat, yet he never worried about his food, nor was he ever afraid to die for the sake of his faith. His voice chanting the sutra was never silenced. The man, Nichiren, who with steadfast faith and conviction always pushed ahead in the promotion of his cause, moved me the most of all religious forces. My husband himself was not unlike a Nichiren disciple in sacrificing his family, not for the sake of the Lotus Sutra, but in action through a faith in the national policy, which he considered as holy and important as the sutra. But alas, his wife, who had been brought up in well-to-do circumstances naturally, like every wife suddenly cast into the wilderness of economic insecurity, was worrying terribly about financial reverses. However, since I was deeply inspired by the spiritual power of Nichiren, who feared neither hunger nor death, who never worried about shelter or clothing, I reached a wonderful calmness of mind, never to be disturbed again by uncertainty, grief, anger, or momentary pleasure. The calmness of my mind is, I should say, an attainment not to be explained to others by words, as many teachers of the Buddhist philosophy would agree. Satori is the Japanese word which indicates a special state of enlightened rest. The Satori, the teachers say, may be defined as an intuitive looking into the nature of things, in contradistinction to the intellectual and logical understanding of life. Modern science maintains that man should always be protected with proper shelter and food to keep him in good health. So-called civilized people are driving themselves into more entanglements by analyzing every element contained in the daily diet and clamoring for specific calories. But my enlightenment came when I saw something which I cannot explain by the logical process. When I responded to the life of Nichiren, the teachers explained this process as the unfolding of a new world, hitherto unperceived in the confusion of a dualistic mind. Or we may say that with Satori, our entire surroundings are viewed from quite an unexpected angle of perception. In the midst of financial problems, I could now take a deep breath as if under the shining spring sun. The teachers explain that whatever the Satori is, the world for those who have gained a Satori is no more the world as it used to be, even with all its flowing streams and burning fires. It is never again the same. Satori is a revolution, a revaluation of the spiritual aspect of one's existence. This change of mind came to me, not through my hard practice of Zazen meditation, but as the balance sheet or gross sum of my years' hard thinking and labor, and the various experiences of my early life. Indeed, it is a pagoda to celebrate my triumph over my serious mental conflicts. Hereafter I shall be able to carry my message forward with never-defeatable courage and conviction, though the road be of thorns. Part 11. The Feminist Front in Japan. Chapter 30. My relation to feminism. Man and woman complete a human being. Both sexes supplement each other, Kant declared. Could there be anything in fact less applicable to Japanese humanity than this statement? The Japanese women are toys to be petted by men, slaves to be driven by owners. Their awakening and self-development do not please men. The relationship between man and wife in a Japanese home is not that of two supplementary personalities, but that of master and servant. It is the relation between the absolute possessor and the property. Indeed, in the presence of others, a Japanese wife refers to her husband, usually with the term master. Naturally, when this human property goes out from home to work, she has to assume a position of independence, quite contradictory with that of slavery. Various stimuli that she receives in the course of her public life necessarily train her personality and cultivate her intelligence. Thus, she may develop into a new being, while her husband remains as he was, so long as the husband fails to understand and trust his wife in the changed circumstances. The contradiction between home life and her public activities will never be resolved. Trying to resolve that conflict by sacrificing public life, I adopted a stoical attitude for a while. This was a time of inner enrichment. I lived quietly. I read and I thought about life as a whole. Even later, when I made an effort to laugh at life and dance away my grief, questions pertaining to the social system, woman's position, and the relationship between woman and the industrial system still haunted me. In an effort to answer them, I tried to form a theory of my own. First of all, I studied the history of Japanese women for more knowledge of changes in their surroundings through the ages. Then I read over and over August Bebel's book on the history of women in general. To this I owe the greater part of my birth control theory, especially the thesis that it could be the agency of woman's emancipation. The Neo-Malthusian doctrine had hitherto attracted me to birth control, nor do I now deny the general adequacy of this doctrine in relating population problems to birth control problems in a capitalistic era, but I cannot now agree with its unconditional assent to the fatal assumptions made by Malthus, who, for one thing, ignored the creative power of science and the cultural growth of mankind. I was never fully satisfied with the Malthusian doctrine, even while I was upholding it, and a re-examination of an essay on the principle of population was a revelation of errors. Next, I studied the philosophy of the poor by Karl Marx, a theoretical opponent of birth control in that he makes the class war the key emancipation and well-being. Given a just distribution of wealth, he maintains, more of mankind could survive on a comfortable basis and be infinitely happier. Marx's theory is that it is the development of capitalism which drives laborers and peasants into extreme poverty, and his theory seems to find convincing proof in Japan as elsewhere. My intimate contact with the poor in the mining districts of my country had opened my mind to the social evil of poverty. Its prevention was a major consideration with me as a fundamental of human development, irrespective of sex. Convinced though I was of the value of birth control as a means of emancipating women, protecting motherhood, and establishing good eugenic practices, after reading Marx, I decided that I had been too narrow in concentrating on its advantages for a single sex. I likewise came to the conclusion that even with a larger acceptance of this agency, the problem of poverty would probably remain. So I became less feministic in a Burgess's way, and more humane in my thinking. This does not mean that my interest in birth control as a method of liberating women from masculine subjection weakened, or that the feminist movement in Japan lost my allegiance, for the very existence of such a movement is evidence of the need. Two streams form the Japanese feminist movement: the middle-class struggle for equality with men and the proletarian struggle for class equality. Burgess feminism accepts the present capitalistic social order, and within the boundary of its operations attempts to lift the position of Japanese women to the standards set by the most advanced Western women. Proletarian feminism is on a more rebellious basis. It denies both the justice and the excellence of the present social system and calls for socialism. The Burgess feminists fought and are still fighting, though greatly hampered, for the elevation of women's position in connection with legal rights. Their demands include the abolition of the restrictions imposed by civil law on the married woman's conduct. For instance, a wife can enter into a legal contract only with her husband's consent. She is thus in a position of a minor who must have the approval of the parental authority for any legal procedure. If she fails to get the necessary consent from her husband, the contract is not valid. The unmarried woman over 20, legally possessing full contractual rights, loses them the moment she marries. Too obviously, our law denies a married woman's personality. The establishment of the married woman's property rights, the Japanese husband has the right to use and gain profits from his wife's property, but the wife can do the same with her husband's property, as well as her own, only when she is the head of the family, a post arrived at only by the legal adoption of the husband into her family. Furthermore, a daughter usually does not inherit property, getting only a small share even of her trousseau. Only by special prenuptial arrangements does the wife bring wealth to a marriage. In the case of divorce by mutual consent, the husband is under no obligation to guarantee the livelihood of his wife. Her fate in the circumstances depends on his sense of moral obligation if he is a person of means. The children belong absolutely to the father. Whether a woman is born in a wealthy family or marries a wealthy man, she is not legally entitled to a penny of the riches, except by special arrangement. This forces the Japanese woman to submit to the existing family system, a slave in a domestic autocracy. The removal of the inexcusable inequality between man and wife in the case of adultery. The husband is liable to penalty only when he is sued by the husband of the woman with whom he committed the crime, and in no other case, so that no matter how questionable his conduct may be in the so-called gay quarters, and even with any other unmarried woman, he is treated as a respectable gentleman by law as well as by society. Whereas, when the wife commits the same crime, regardless of the position of the man thus involved, whether married or unmarried, she can be punished by her husband immediately. This unfairness not only insults the Japanese woman, but necessarily leads to the moral degradation of society by overlooking the husband's indulgence and condemning the wife. To eliminate the legal unfairness towards women, our Burgess feminists are convinced of the necessity of obtaining the suffrage, the right to vote, and the right to hold office. But the truth is that the Japanese woman has no right to join a political organization of any sort. Even the right to attend a political meeting and to hear political speeches was withheld from her until 1922. Hence, the immediate step towards enfranchisement scarcely goes beyond a request for the freedom to join political parties. The proletarian women's movement has similar objectives, but it starts with an attack on capitalistic tyrannies. It identifies itself with the class war. Consequently, this group has the same and wider objectives than the Burgess women's group. These two branches of the Japanese woman movement conflict with each other ideologically speaking, but practically they have much in common, such as the desire to change the feudalistic rules and views of life, and to elevate women's legal position. Despite the mutual objectives, these two groups have often been rather hostile. For certain domestic reasons, I had to choose an independent path and join neither of these women's parties. I accepted the fact calmly for a while, believing that there was too much sentimentalism and excessive sex antagonism in the feminist movement anyway. For a sounder approach to the issues raised, it seemed to me that deeper study was required and that we must have a woman's institute. I found co-workers for the institute in Miss Fusei Ichikawa, Miss Natsu Kawasaki, Miss Ito Nizuma, and Miss Shigiri Kaneko, whose acquaintance I had enjoyed since our relief work for the Russian famine. Other friends gave us support. Our purpose in establishing our research institute is to be found in the following prospectus, dated October 1925. Women have lived in the past in a condition quite different from that of men. Naturally, there has been a world peculiar to us marked by phenomena exclusively concerning women. This divergence was true not only of the past, but it is true today, and even if the time comes when our social circumstances shall be entirely identical with those of men, problems will still remain in some form, caused by the differences of sex. However, there has never occurred in the past a single worthy study of those phenomena of the women's world. Such studies as have been published have all represented men's views. Again, there is a great deal of breath spent in the daily papers on the transition circumstances that women today are facing, yet no concrete substantiation of the statements accompanies them. Lately, there have been sprung up a number of women's organizations with professed purposes of elevating women's position and obtaining women's rights, but most of them have sentimental motives only, with very little reservation for sound thinking based on accurate facts. In this situation, we venture to establish an institution in which one can study the history of women's social problems and make detailed investigations into the fundamental relations of man and woman. Consequently, this institution restricts its activities to research. It does not participate actively in movements, and without restricting ourselves to any one school of thought, religious sect, or class, we pledge ourselves to study impartially the problems of women on a factual basis. Lastly, however, we add that, although primarily established for research, as distinguished from propaganda, this institution shall offer every moral support in its power to the cause of elevating the position of women and advancing feminine rights. This institution, based on the above prospectus, competently furnished to some of our women's organizations the scientific materials with which to operate more intelligently. This institute had not a small part in promoting the higher education of Japanese women. In 1919, the Society for the Advancement of Women's Education was organized, mainly by men educators of women. It met with little success. About 1922 or 23, the time when our feminist movement was vigorous, the cry for equal educational opportunity commanded attention. It was but a natural incident that with the close relationship between women's education and the feminist movement, the feminists should join the cry. The following figures obtained in 1928 indicate the slow growth of our women's education compared with our men's, although both forms were started at the same time in early Meiji. Against 222 institutions of university and college standard for our men, there are only 37 of a similar kind for women. Of the total number of students in the above institutions, 161,430 are men, and 14,127 are women. As for our middle schools, there are 1,915 for 590,710 enrolled boys, whereas there are 934 for 405,427 girls. With these scanty women's educational institutions and low academic standards, it is no wonder the Japanese feminist movement should advance so slowly. Owing to the close interrelationship between the elevation of women's position and their education, the feminists have been asking for the right of women to study with men in the government universities, but the government has never admitted women except as listeners on the simple pretext that there is no preparatory process for women corresponding with that which takes place at the men's higher school, the only educational institution qualifying students to try for the entrance examination of the government universities. By the regulations originally drawn in early Meiji, this higher school is open only to boys. The elimination of the single phrase for men in the article would give women an absolutely equal educational opportunity with men, yet the government will not bother about it. This is partly due to the government's unwillingness to grant the privilege to women when the educational expenditure at present is running to high figures in the budget, and partly to the old Confucian teaching still exercising an influence on the authorities, making them deny the propriety of coeducation. A vote is the key to the happiness of women, the feminists declared. Get the vote, get a precious vote to move the governmental machine for the benefit of women, too. Finally, convinced that action was imperative, I stepped out from the ivory tower of my institute to join the women's suffrage campaign in the Alliance of Suffragettes, the leading body in our feminist movement. I was appointed chairman of the finance committee. Like many other movements of this kind in every country, the Suffragettes Alliance was in dire need of funds. The women's cry for equal legal treatment was strong in the campaign, but their purse was always miserably weak, in contradiction to their voices. We went out and visited women of the upper class, asking for contributions. Some said that they didn't care for such an unwomanly business, while others said that they had to ask their husband's consent for that, and almost without exception their husbands gave no funds for the campaign of their rivals, as they regarded us. Therefore, in order to raise a somewhat substantial sum, I organized a club called Shidzue, Bright Sunshine Society, mainly among those burgess women who had sympathy with the movement, yet could not share in its activity on account of their family bonds. This enterprise was successful, gaining sympathy from a great many literary men, artists, and journalists, together with their wives, and producing a sum unusual for this kind of organization. With this comparative abundance of money, we could accomplish a large amount of work, at least for some time after the men's acquisition of the suffrage, when the extension of civil rights to women was conceived as logical. Our women suffrage movement reached a flourishing stage in its history, concentrating on the right to local enfranchisement as the first step to general suffrage. I spoke at many public meetings. I joined men's political campaigns at general elections to ask votes from the platform for candidates who were in favor of woman suffrage. We mobilized our force to petition the Diet. Kasuke Mochizuki, Home Minister of the Sayukai Cabinet of 1927, replied to the delegation who presented this petition: "Go back to your home and wash your babies' clothes. That is the job given to you, and there is the place in which you are entitled to sit." But in spite of this poor comprehension of women's problems by the minister, many of the Diet members of the political parties, Sayukai and Minsito, were well aware that sooner or later the enfranchisement of women must come in the natural course of the political development of the country. Kenzo Adachi, Home Minister of the Minsai Cabinet, which succeeded the Sayukai Cabinet, showed himself quite sympathetic with women's movements, and made an effort to have the bill for the granting of civic rights to women passed in the Diet. Although greatly revised, this bill did pass the House of Representatives under this cabinet in 1930. How excited we were with this triumph! Along luck stayed with us but a very short moment. The House of Peers rejected the bill without serious discussion. One nobleman spoke for all when he said, "In Japan there is an admirable ideal of knighthood. made for the protection of the weak. What an impertinence on the part of women to claim their rights when they are under men's perfect protection. The representative opinion of the House was that women's intrusion into public affairs would endanger the peace of the individual family as well as the family system of Japan, the foundation stone of the country, as they said. Even though the bill was rejected by the House of Peers, the fact that it did pass the House of Representatives set a significant precedent for the Japanese feminist movement. Thus encouraged, the feminist organizations redoubled their zeal, and this was their most flourishing time. While Burgess feminism was attempting to lift the position of Japanese women to the standards reached in the most advanced Western nations, the proletarian women's movement acknowledged itself to be a part of the proletarian class war. Reactionary currents of thought, however, began to rule Japan, and the issue of Manchuria pressing to the fore in September 1931 changed the entire social and political situation in the country. Even liberal citizens were hushed by the rise of militarism. The feminist movement suffered a great setback. Though its claim is rational, though its appeal is touching, Japanese feminism at best cannot compare with the type I have observed in Western countries. The difference is too sadly striking. Truly, the feminist movement of a country reflects its women's social status. In my country, the pipers play music, but women do not line up in a grand following behind the leaders. Even if the feminists succeeded in changing the married women's property rights, where is the property to be inherited by them? Even if the government opened its universities to girls, how would they manage to enter them to enjoy this privilege? The Japanese people as a whole are so poor. In this relation, the objectives stressed by the proletarian women's group must be better adapted to the majority of our women. Yet women, as a mass, do not endorse that brand of feminism either. Feudalism is the point from which we must start our fight for feminism. It is only yesterday that we emerged into the new world of industrialism, and feudalism has clung to us like a leech. The feminist movement elsewhere has kept pace with the democracy of which it is the shadow. In European countries, it had a long history of struggle against the final triumph over the power of feudal aristocracy, and in a country like America, whose constitution is based on the liberty of the people, individual liberty is the foundation of social life. But in Japan, where modern capitalism was rashly combined with the deep-rooted feudal forces, all in a flash, liberalism in its complete sense is incapable of free development. Thus, feminism, with its concentration on women's enfranchisement, was obliged to retreat under the sudden rise of the fascist power which grew out of Japan's crisis in her international relations. Chapter 31 History of Feminism in Japan. So far, I have emphasized my relation to the feminist movement and its present status. To leave the discussion there would imply that the time depth of this movement is shallow, whereas the truth is that it dates back to the beginning of the Meiji era. This greatest time depth is important to understand, for its roots of thought about the position of women in our society have so grounded themselves in the social thought of Japanese intellectuals that reliance is still placed on their vitality for eventual flowering. When I joined our feminist movement, there were a number of Burgess organizations, and the proletarian organization too was in a flourishing condition, indulging in some warm controversies over ideologies with the Burgess women, the outstanding middle-class feminist, the Kyojukai, were Christian humanist. The Women's Suffragettes Alliance was a political department of the Federation of Women's Organizations, formed immediately after the earthquake in 1923. But as I say, the history of feminism runs back into the 19th century, when Japan's resistance to world trade was broken down. The new government that came into being in the confusion of the Meiji Restoration adopted almost wholesale Western ideas for its policies and institutions, and their influence was responsible for liberalism in Japan. Rousseau's Natural Right of Man, Montesquieu's Theory of Sovereignty, Bentham's Utilitarianism, and Mill's Liberty and Equality were eagerly read and discussed among Japanese women. Mill was a radical force with his plea for sex equality. The Restoration government discarded the political and economic phases of the feudal systems and adopted or was forced to follow Western capitalistic enterprise. In the social life, it succeeded in abolishing by law a few feudal customs, such as the wearing of swords by samurai, men's peculiar hairdressing, and the discriminating appellations, honorifics based on class. But the mental and spiritual adjustments of the nation could not take place by fiat alone. The feudalistic conception of women as man's property still was dominant among the people, affecting the habits of both sexes. Nevertheless, Mill's subjection of women, when introduced into this society, had a profound influence. As early as 1876, Koho Dohi threw down the gauntlet for Japanese feminism by publishing a book called Great Civilized Learning for Women, based on Mill's perspective. From Tokugawa Times, The Great Learning for Women, which I discussed in an earlier chapter, had been held to be the final authority for women's education, inculcating among them the feeling of inferiority to men. And of course it remained the supreme authority for society at large. The vast majority of women were untouched by the revolutionary doctrine of sex equality. In spite of this, with the growth of capitalism and the advancement of Burgess liberalism, the feminist theories were widely debated, and interested men and women began to draw together. In the middle of the Meiji era, following the discussion of Mr. Dohi's volume, came others, Women's Rights in the Western Countries, by Hokichi Yamato, 1882, Nike Fukama's Are Mills Equality, 1884, Yukichi Fukuzawa's On Women, 1885, and On Social Intercourse of Man and Woman, 1886, Miss Nao Inusa's Japanese Woman, 1886. Kojiro Tatsumi's History of Women's Rights in the West and in Japan, 1887. Koyoda's Monogamy, 1887. And Seiyu Nakayama's Japanese Women of Tomorrow, 1888. But alas, only one of these books was written by a woman. Men seem to be the better feminist. The Burgess view of feminism was definitely established with the publication of criticisms on the Great Learning for Women and Revised Great Learning for Women, written by Hukichi Fukuzawa, and both published in 1898. In the former, the author argued for the elevation of the Japanese woman's position, attacking word by word Great Learning for Women, and declared that the old moral code was unjust to our sex. Meanwhile, the westernization policy adopted by the Restoration government had brought some actual changes in the education of women. In December 1871, a few months after the establishment of the Department of Education, July 1871, the government issued an edict to the following effect: the prosperity of each family depends upon each individual's awakening to the sense of responsibility, regardless of sex. Now, while we have educational institutions for men, there is none for women. Hereby we establish a girls' public school by hiring Western women teachers and admitting students, whether noble or common, on their presentation of the tuition. Applicants shall send in their applications by January 15th, 1872. This was the first girls' public school in Japan. Together with this government school for girls, a number of private girls' schools were established. Among them were schools founded by the feudal lords for their clans, notably the Izushi, Toyoka, Matsu, Iwakuni, Nagoya, and Fukuyama girls' schools. The Christian missionary schools for girls established about this time were Joshi Gakuen, Aoyama Jokauen, and Rikayo Girls' School in Tokyo, Ferris Girls' School in Kyoritas Girls' School in Yokohama, Doshisha Girls' School in Kyoto, Baika Girls' School in Osaka, and Kobe Jogakuen, now Kobe College, in Kobe. In 1874, a girls' higher normal school was established in Tokyo through the initiative of Jujimaro Tanaka, Minister of Education, and there followed the establishment of a number of girls' public schools in the local districts. This surely shows a great public enthusiasm for women's education in the 70s, but there was more evidence. In 1871, 5 Japanese girls of impressionable ages were sent abroad by the government, accompanying the party of Prince Tomomi Iwakura on a round-the-world trip to observe Western life. Toiko Yeda, aged 18, Ryako Yoshimasu, aged 16, Sutamatsu Yamakawa, aged 12, Shigeko Nagai, aged 10, and Ome Tsuda, aged 9. All of them were taken into American homes, and 3 of them went to college in America. Prior to their departure, they were honored with an audience by the Empress, who spoke the following gracious words of encouragement and farewell. Her Majesty appreciates your ambition to study abroad, as Japanese women's education is in a stage of transition. You will bring yourselves up to be the models for your countrywomen on your completion of the intended study abroad. Miss Ume Tsuda, the youngest of the 5, became the founder of the famous Tsuda College in Japan. Such enlightenment may lead one to expect that a great advance in the actual feminist movement itself followed swiftly. The fact was quite to the contrary. However, for the feminist movement was regarded merely as a minor activity inside the men's liberal movement. The true feminine elements were for some time represented by the activities of Miss Toshiko Nakajima and Miss Aiko Kagayama. The men's liberal movement developed as a challenge to the conservative politics of the bureaucratic government, which was made up of the surviving forces of the old feudal regime and rather timid innovators. The immediate demand of the movement was the realization of a constitution and parliamentary government. The Burgess liberals, forming a political party of their own, sought to propagandize among those members of the Burgess who failed to gain governmental patronage, and among the discontented landowners who were the victims of the advancing capitalism. From 1880 to 1884, the movement took on militant activities such as leading peasants' revolts, and proved to be a great menace to the autocratic government. Persecuted by the government, deprived of much of its freedom of activity, and finally suffering from internal dissensions, it had in 1884 to declare voluntary dissolution. This dissolution of the Liberal Party restored everything to a smooth surface in appearance, but in reality, discontent against the autocratic government was smoldering. It was not extinguished. The government, with a view to revising the humiliating foreign treaties which it had been forced to sign under the circumstances of the Restoration, adopted a policy of extreme westernization as a demonstration of Japanese genius for self-government. It built the famous Rokume-kan reception hall, later the Peers Club building, and held grand dancing parties there. The entire aristocracy and the upper burgesses got intoxicated with the gay imitation of the Western diplomatic manners. Lords and ladies, not long out of their lacquered polonikins, stepped up to the lively Vienna waltz in European ball dresses. This is what we call the Rokume-kan period of Japanese culture. With the approach of the promulgation of the Constitution and of the opening of the Diet, which the government had previously promised to bring about in the year 1889, public agitation in many forms became increasingly intense. In 1887, the worried government issued the tyrannical Peace Preservation Law, another noteworthy event in the cultural history of Japan. This law completely repressed opposition parties, but in so doing aroused a nationalistic reaction to its extreme westernization policy. Our feminist movement, which had displayed a precarious existence under the wing of general liberalism, was now almost completely destroyed by the successive unfavorable circumstances accompanying the dissolution of the Liberal Party with the issuance of the Peace Preservation Law. After this, with the development of capitalism in Japan, labor questions came steadily into being as something inseparable from the economic phases of the new social order. As for the feminist movement, it almost disappeared. The Peace Preservation Law, designed for the suppression of any political and social movement which might arise among the people, explicitly excluded Japanese women from the right to join political parties and to attend political gatherings, even in the form of lecture meetings. Thus the early feminist movement was brought to an ignominious end. However, books expressing new ideas on women's education, particularly those by Yukichi Fukuzawa, although quite aristocratic in temper, were to leave their input upon women. Now that political opportunities of any kind were specifically denied, women turned to writing as a way of expressing their insurgency. From about that time, Japanese literature exhibited more naturalism and less romanticism. Naturalistic literature taught more Japanese women to be self-conscious, as the themes show: home and myself, society and myself, woman as a human being. North European literature, especially Ibsen's The Doll's House, Ghost, The Lady of the Sea, and The Weaver, helped to stir the native women. Ellen Key also provoked thought. Her Love and Marriage and Women movement did not differ much in substance from Fukuzawa's revised Great Learning for Women, but her works, by virtue of their absolute denial of feudalistic morals and the glorification of love, became a sensation to the Japanese women when they were put into their hands. They now dared to dream of romantic love and to grow critical of domestic servitude. The influences emanating from Ellen Key and other North European writers were to be seen later in 1911 in the organization of the Sato Society, which is the Japanese way of saying Blue Stocking Society. This noted young women's movement is now considered to have been the true pioneer in Burgess feminism. The Japanese Blue Stocking Society included among its members and supporters most of the literary women of the time, who had hitherto been fighting their battle only with the pen. The declaration published in the Seto, the monthly organ of the society, reads as follows: Woman in the primitive age was the sun, a real and just human personality. The ancestor of the Japanese race is worshipped as the sun goddess. Now she is the moon, dependent on others for a livelihood. The moon that borrows light from others, pale like a sick patient. We are to restore the hidden sun, find the hidden sun, which is our genius. This is our constant cry, and the inspiration of our unified purpose. The culmination of this cry this thirst, this desire shall lead to the finding of genius in ourselves. This declaration, though short and very poetically stated, is convincing with respect to the earnest attitude manifest towards the issue of women's freedom and emancipation. This bold assertion of the awakened woman astounded the conservatives of the country. On the one hand, and on the other, it stimulated the feminine public to thought and action. Thus, feminism revived through the stimulus of literary women. Yet, in spite of its fiery zeal, the Seto Society had to end as a mere literary movement because of lack of funds, and feminists had to remain cautious. The crushing of socialist leaders on the charge of high treason drove social criticism of every sort underground. However, even in this dark age, the implanted ideas grew in the hearts of the people, from Ellen Key's Love and Marriage to Edward Carpenter's Love's Coming of Age, and on to Bebel's works on women. A movement in thought made its way through Japan. Towards the end of the Great War, immediately after the Russian Revolution, great new currents of ideas flowed into our country. The war for democracy, in which Japan had been arrayed on the side of Democrats, necessarily stimulated the discussion of women's status. The fact that the promotion of women's rights had been so slow in Japan, which had seldom lagged in the international industrial competition, indicates to what extent the Japanese are psychologically bound by the leftover feudalistic ideas and practices. It was about 1920, the time when the movement for men's universal suffrage was approaching victory, that the feminist movement assumed a united front for universal suffrage not discriminatory in the matter of sex. No longer able to suppress the democratic impulse, the Japanese government granted manhood suffrage, but it stopped short of enfranchising women. After the grant of manhood suffrage, women took heart anyway. They pushed organization directed to winning political, legal, and social rights. They had won victory. They got the right to attend political meetings, almost accidentally, when in 1922 the Peace Preservation Police Act was revised as a result of the spirited protest by laborers against the prohibition of their right to strike. Except for this single privilege, our women are still rightless. They cannot join political parties. In such a situation, it is but natural that spirited leaders should be so impatient to awaken their meek sisters to a sense of woman's innate power and potentialities. It must be recorded, however, that impatience is all the Japanese woman can for the moment know. A nationalist reaction against liberalism has recently swept all else before it in the island empire. Fascism, with its strong militaristic flavor, is no defender of feminism, with its strong humanistic flavor. This is the contemporary current of opinion, which has caught even women in its high tide. Part 12. A New Start. Accumulated discontent with the theories and practices surviving from feudalism helped to turn my face towards modernism, and dire need helped to hold my attention to the future. One cold winter day, during my husband's absence, which had become habitual through his frequent and prolonged journeys to Korea and Manchuria. The old art collection amid which I had been living was assessed by his creditors, who threatened to carry them all out of the house to pay off the loan my husband had got by mortgaging them. In this emergency, my father came to my financial help, and the objects of art were rescued, but the experience taught me how insecure was my economic situation, and I realized that I could no longer dawdle, that I must face the future with less of compromise. The education of my sons was now placed squarely on my shoulders. I must earn a living for us three. Fortunately, at this crisis, an invitation came from America for me to lecture there, and daring as was this undertaking, considering the state of my English and my competence on the platform, I accepted the challenge. Behind the invitation stood my uncle, Yasuke Tsurumi, who was in New York at the time, and the Herbert Houstons, who had long been interested in Japan. The Feakins Lecture Bureau was ready to arrange my tour. I was told that I would be expected to speak on Japanese women, the culture of my country, and what was going on in Manchuria. What was more, I must begin the tour without delay. Of course, days were spent in the rush and strain of preparing lectures, closing my house, settling my sons in the home of my parents, and practicing English. As my boat left its moorings at Yokohama, my heart was almost bursting with emotions, but it would never have done to betray the fact to my family and friends. Really, as excited as I was, who bowed me off so politely and formally in the proper Japanese way. Fire within, calm without. How I ever accomplished this bold and hazardous tour in the year 1932-3, I do not know. It ranged from California to New York and back, including communities so diverse as Boston, Palm Beach, and Dallas, Texas. I had to travel alone. I had to broadcast, give difficult interviews at all times and places. There was much banqueting with after-dinner speaking. One evening I addressed a congregation from a pulpit in a Unitarian church in Canada. Another evening I spoke in a free synagogue. An ex-missionary to Japan, Dr. Horace Coleman, was the chairman at a meeting in Boston when angry questions about Manchuria were asked from the floor, and I was deeply thankful for his presence. Sometimes there were equally urgent diplomatic adventures which I had to meet unchampioned, notably one at Palm Beach, when a sturdy American patriot and national naval hero sitting at my side burst forth with anti-Japanese sentiments, which I had to counter with corresponding passion. And once there was a rough physical adventure on the street, when a sudden lurch of my taxi threw me against the front seat, and knocked out several of my front teeth. As a result, I was brought to appreciate even more fully American hospitality and friendship. Dr. and Miss Frederick Peterson of New York City kept me in their home for weeks. They engaged a nurse to watch over my diet, build up my nerves, and attend me on my trips to the X-ray specialist and the dentist. While I was recuperating, my hosts were zealous for my comfort, sensitive to every aspect of my plight, and eager to learn all they could about Japan, which they had visited, but only for a short time. Miss Peterson even wanted to try one of the Zen exercises. I performed Japanese dances for them. I enjoyed telling them about our arts, especially since they had studied the Chinese background and possessed some fine specimens of Chinese painting. Through these gracious New Yorkers, I met many other Americans, some of whom entertained me in turn. Thus I had the rare delight of visiting Mr. and Mrs. Louis Ludo, whose villa at Cornwall on the Hudson is so refined in its setting and so aesthetic in its restraint that it suggests a Zen monastery. They have been close students of Oriental culture. They own a splendid collection of Japanese prints, paintings, and no robes. We talked about Lady Murasaki and Baseo, and in these noble surroundings I found it possible to rest and for a time forget the changing world. I was just a daughter of a samurai again. But I came sharply up against the present through my renewed association with Margaret Sanger, the Invincible. In her clinic, I studied intently the latest methods of birth control. Together we went now and then to meetings, where each of us presented her philosophy with respect to the object of birth control. Miss Sanger and Miss Ruth Litt introduced me to the group of New York women who aid in promoting this movement, and we had chances to discuss ways and means which might be helpful in Japan. In addition to enlightening me, Miss Sanger gave me magnanimous personal attention, inviting me to her home and looking after my comfort in countless ways. Her amazing secretary, Rose, was all devotion. Feeling that I needed diversion, she bore me off to Coney Island late one afternoon, and we had a very lively time there indeed, running to catch boats and trains, riding on merry-go-rounds, shooting the chutes, and seeing the resort as others see it while enjoying ourselves in similar style. Always for public lectures and for formal dinners, I wore my native costume. It seemed to create the best atmosphere for friendship. Since I wore Western costume at other times, I often felt as exotic in my native dress as I doubtless looked to others. However, I felt utterly at home in it during a convention at Chicago which I attended. This had been called by the National Council of Women, and women from many foreign lands were present to give it an international flavor. Some of these guests were, like myself, in native apparel. Thus I had the pleasure of feeling rather more dignified than exotic, as I sat beside Selma Ekram of Turkey, for example, who wore her fascinating native dress. She is the author of that important book on Turkish women, Unveiled. I was deeply impressed by her skill in handling the English language, by her directness of expression, and by her knowledge. But I did the best I could to represent my race too, since the general theme set by this conference was our common cause, civilization. The speeches all revolved around the idea of women in a changing world, and since they were delivered by such forceful women as Miss Carrie Chapman, Cat Jane Addams, and Margaret Bondfield of England, I derived from them a stronger determination than ever to face the modern world courageously and as intelligently as possible. To aid in my emancipation from the traditional burdens of Japanese housekeeping, with a view to saving time for public work, I purchased out of my lecture fees several conveniences, such as studio beds and rugs requiring less care than straw mats. To interest my young sons and American boys, I bought for each of them a silver wrist watch, such as the Scouts wear, but I also spent some of my earnings for the most up-to-date equipment for a scientifically managed birth control clinic. Helped financially by my tour in the West and stimulated mentally and emotionally by the experience, I returned to Tokyo to take up a new life in greater earnest, with stronger conviction. There could scarcely be retreat into the past now for me. I knew that I should have to struggle against spells of melancholia, for these had attacked me even during my lecture tour in the United States. There had been some inevitable nostalgia for things once, and indeed still beloved. I had been overpowered at times by the consciousness of the relative poverty of Japan to America. The larger opportunities for women of the West and their larger numbers of brave innovators made our Japanese life and labor seem too much of a contrast to be borne. I found it hard to keep my eyes fixed steadfastly on the work I must do. In some respects, my American tour was devastating to my spirit. Nevertheless, I understood very well my own inner difficulties, and on my return I hurried to prepare for the opening of a clinic in Tokyo, which would be scientific in practice and non-commercial in interest. First, I had to persuade the police authorities that I was not a dangerous subject of the Crown, so I showed them the equipment which I had brought from New York and explained how birth control was handled today in the West, and as I interpreted the movement to them, the austere gentlemen in gold braid, with swords at their sides, nodded slightly and formally from time to time, despite their affiliation with a government concerned with an abundant supply of soldiers. These nods enabled me to open in March 1934 the scientifically operated birth control clinic of which I had dreamed. The birth control movement of Japan supported this experiment. Miss Kawasaki, a prominent newspaper journalist and a woman's counselor, took it under her powerful protection. Other friends rallied about it, but there remained the task of convincing the poor mothers at large that Buddha would not punish them for entering our clinic. Like myself, they face two ways, but civilization is our common cause.